Hello, my name is Richie Sutliff. I'm an undergraduate fellow at the O'Brien Notre Dame International Security Center. Joining me today is Professor Chris Fettweis of Tulane University. Professor, just to start out here, I was wondering if you could briefly introduce yourself, your focus of study, and maybe summarize a couple of the main points from your talk today.
Well, thank you for having me, first of all, and I'll be happy. My name is Chris Fettweis. I'm a professor at Tulane. I study international security, U.S. foreign policy, grand strategy. I went to school here 30 years ago, but more accurately, I went to school in a place right here, but it wasn't this university, which has expanded dramatically in the last 30 years, as it turns out. But I'm going to be talking today about something that nobody probably in the room has any experience with or has thought about much at all, which is the grand strategy of medieval China. And you might wonder, who cares? Well, I'm going to hopefully convince you that somebody should care about it.
Of course, of course. I'm excited to hear what you have there. Looking back to kind of your undergraduate time here at Notre Dame, like you were saying, I was wondering what originally motivated you to specialize in foreign policy, and particularly in grand strategy, especially given your undergraduate degree in history.
Right, I was a history major. I took 4 classes with Father Kirby, which maybe somebody watching this may remember. But it wasn't until after I graduated and had a year or so out. I traveled for a while. I lived in New York, the New York area. I was working as a flunky in a law firm, and I realized I didn't want to go back to graduate school to study history. I wanted something that was a little bit forward-looking too, that had some maybe more relevance for the present as well as the past. So I'm basically a historian in a political science department in some ways, but security studies gives you the opportunity to study both.
Yeah, definitely. And with security studies in mind, I was wondering how your views on U.S. foreign policy and grand strategy, which you focus in, have kind of evolved and taken different forms as you've grown in your academic life.
One of the big events for people of my generation was, well, 9/11 and the war in Iraq, which you can ask your parents about. I know you have no experience with that, no memory of that. It was a formative event, though, of people, especially I was in graduate school at the time. And how to react to that, what to do, what the purpose of American power should be was the big formative event for me. And the war in Iraq and how it seemed at the time, and seems in retrospect, it was profoundly stupid. And why did we do that? How do we think that was going to be a good idea? And how can we make better choices in the future was the big event in my scholarly career.
Yeah, of course. Very interesting. Looking more towards your content and then the content of your talk, you recently published a book, The Pursuit of Dominance, which examines about 2,000 years of superpower grand strategy around the world. Big topic there. And I was wondering how this long historical sweep that you kind of encapsulate then informs your view of the contemporary powers, especially like China and the United States today.
Right. The book tries to look at the big, strong powers of the world, the Roman Empire, the Mongols, the medieval China we're going to be talking about today, the British Empire, and seeing if there were lessons for the dominant power today, the United States. A lot of people, it's sort of a cottage industry to think that the United States is declining. That's been the situation. People have thought the United States is declining since I was in junior high. So maybe it's declining, maybe it's just a constant theme. So in my mind, it's still a pretty dominant country. So how can we avoid the mistakes of the past? What did the people of the past do right? What did they do wrong? And how can we learn from them? So that's kind of where we are. That's where I started that project. And it was easier between 2016 and 2020. I wasn't too terribly happy thinking about current U.S. grand strategy for various reasons. It was easier for me to focus on Rome and medieval China.
Yeah.
Just for no reason at all.
Yeah, definitely some time to look back there. Now, looking at your other publications, I hadn't had time to read them all, obviously, but I've skimmed through them. Oh, of course. And I was specifically interested in how medieval Chinese foreign policy, it seems like a little bit of a departure, especially from some of your other works and kind of your focus. And I was wondering what drew you to medieval China in particular and how that connects with the broader picture of grand strategy that you have.
It was China's golden age. And it's the most important bilateral relationship in the world, U.S.-China right now. And we have no idea, generally speaking, people in the United States have no idea about what happened in Chinese history. They wrote everything down, unlike people in the West, so we know what happened, but we don't study it at all. And the Tang era was the golden age of Chinese history. They learn about there's 2 emperors during that time that they think of as their greatest emperors ever. There was the one empress in Chinese history, came from that era, the one time China was run by a woman. They're learning lessons from that era. Maybe would be good for us to at least figure out what they're learning, to take a look and see what's that era, how they put together their grand strategy, what they did, and what it may say about their strategic culture today. So that was why that chapter was included in the book.
Yeah, definitely. And again, referencing that specific chapter, you spent a lot of time talking about how Chinese culture, and specifically the soft power that they kind of exuded, was a big tool for their grand strategy at the time. I was wondering how you see these cultural and strategic elements kind of carrying over to maybe a modern era of Chinese foreign policy and grand strategy. Perhaps I was thinking with things like the Belt and Road Initiative.
Yeah, well, it's interesting because unlike all the other cases in my book, Rome had the best military of its era. The Mongols had this unbelievable cavalry. The British had this unbelievable navy. The Chinese military wasn't that good. It compared to other of its time, they did not have a dominant military. In fact, they would lose when they had 10-to-1 superiority over their opponents regularly. So what do you do? How do you put together a strategy if you don't have a reliable military? And so that's the kind of the key puzzle for that era that I'll be talking about today. What do you do if you're, and there's reasons behind this, and we'll talk about what they are. But the Chinese emperors, the Tang emperors, did not have a military that they could guarantee was going to do well on the battlefield. So they used other tools of power. They used diplomacy, economic tools, cultural tools. If there ever had been 100 million Romans, we still would be speaking Latin because they punched way above their weight. The Romans did. And they would regularly be what they call barbarian units, much, much bigger than their own. The Chinese were the opposite. They need to have 20-to-1, 30-to-1 advantage in order to win on the battlefield. So how do you put together a strategy if you can't rely on your military? Yeah. And what does that say about today, about the military effectiveness going forward for China? Because as we're going to see in the coming attractions, that's been the case throughout a lot of Chinese history. Their armies have underperformed.
Yeah, definitely. Now flipping the script, now you also talked a little bit about how you're hoping your book can help inform kind of U.S. policymakers a little bit. Mm-hmm. And I was wondering, in your perspective, what should guide U.S. policymakers as they respond to this current growing influence of China around the world, and kind of what key strategic question they should really be asking before they start making foreign policy decisions?
We tend to think that other countries are not as affected by our actions as they are. I think one of the key lessons, if you want to think about how to influence Chinese decision-making, they're reacting to us to a large extent. It's not. There are some people who think China has this grand plan to dominate the world in a couple generations. They think 1,000 years ahead. Well, it could also be that we have surrounded their country with military bases, and they're reacting to us, and they're justifiably, or at least from their mind, understandably paranoid. And so they build up their military power. Maybe if we weren't so much in their face, maybe if we realized how much our actions influence what they do, we'd make better decisions. Because if there's one consistent lesson throughout all the great dominant powers I looked at, they all get into trouble at some point with overextension. They tend to identify their interests way too far out. They tend to take on too many challenges at the same time, and they run into trouble. Overconfidence, overextension is the big threat. Do we really have to be worried about what's going on in the South China Sea? Do we really have to worry about what happens with Taiwan? It's not clear that every single part of the world is a vital U.S. interest.
Yeah, very interesting. Now looking more thematically here, I was wondering, given your focus on grand strategy in general, I was wondering how you see the role of the non-military tools that a nation can use. You talked about earlier, like the economic, the diplomatic, and the cultural tools, as opposed to the more strict, hard military power in shaping state behavior around the world.
Well, one thing, whether you like him or you hate him, Donald Trump is quite clear that economic tools are going to be a big part of his foreign policy. And wielding tariffs and backing off tariffs sometimes and making deals that suit his view of what proper trade relationship should be is the kind of tool that a really strong economic power can wield. We have substantial power that it does not necessarily have to come from the barrel of a gun. We had just access to U.S. markets, as Donald Trump knows, it can motivate countries to do what we want them to do. It's harder to wield cultural powers, the soft power. Those are powers that tend to come with they're a byproduct of what you do rather than a product. They're hard to monetize and wield. But we have substantial economic reserves, and we have diplomatic and political clout, and can achieve a lot of goals with non-military methods that we often underestimate.
Yeah. You mentioned a little bit earlier about how you think the United States is in a pretty good spot, but there's some things that are changing right now. Mm-hmm. I was wondering if in the near future, say, that the United States were to lose its position as kind of this world dominant force all across the globe, as was eventually the case with the Tang Dynasty, as you talk about. How do you think the United States as a nation would respond, both as a government and as a people?
That's a great question. I ask my students this: do you think the United States could ever handle being number two? Some people say we're not just a competitive country, we're hyper-competitive. Everything's got to be ranked. We have to be number one. We rank everything. We can't just have good restaurants. What's the best restaurant? We can't just have good movies. What's the best picture? The prettiest woman. We have the dumbest one, best dog. We can't just have good dogs. We have to know what's the best dog. That's a sign of cultural weirdness. Nobody else does that. So maybe something in our cultural identity says demands that we be number one. But really, is there practical value to it? Let's say the Chinese economy grows bigger than ours. Are they going to start pushing us around? Are they going to hit the beach at Burbank and start working their way east? It's not like it's going to be a big threat. What is the practical application today? And it's in a time when attack on the United States seems kind of ridiculous. There's a movie from the 1960s. The Chinese burrow under the Pacific and pop out next to Las Vegas. Outside of that, we have very few actual threats. So what if we slip to number two and it's substantial time in the future where the Chinese economy would actually be bigger than ours, especially on a per capita basis, or their military would be more capable. We're talking a generation from now. But if it happens, would that really be a big deal? Could we? Maybe our pride would be hurt. Maybe we wouldn't want to get big foam hands with a two, and we were number two. But is it a practice? Would it really affect our daily lives much? Maybe not. Especially maybe the Chinese could buy more of our crap and make us more rich. I don't think losing status should be seen as a threat. I think it would be. People would freak out. We'd elect somebody who would say, "Well, keep China down. We'll be number one." But really, for what? Just because we can be the best dog? Great. So we can. One of the things they do in those dog shows, does the dog respond when you manipulate his testicles? What have we done as a culture where that's important? I don't know. But are we hyper-competitive? Too hyper-competitive? Could we be number two? The answer is, yeah, we'd be fine. But would we freak out? Quite possibly.
So one last question here. Maybe a little more positive than the last. Looking ahead into the future, what emerging issues do you see as being overlooked in grand strategy and foreign policy that you think the next generation of scholars, as well as perhaps policymakers, should really start focusing on?
Here's the message for your generation. You live in a golden age. Nobody's going to tell you this, and you probably never heard this. The amount of warfare is at a lower level than ever before. You're going to live longer than any of your ancestors did. You're going to be safer. You're going to have less pain. You have something called Novocaine, which your ancestors never had, which is much better when you go to the dentist. Your life is better. And it's not, sure, there's wars. There's Gaza, there's Ukraine, there's Sudan, which nobody talks about. There's always been wars. It's just at a lower level. And there's 8.3 billion of us now. We got to be at 1 billion in about 1800 or so. And there was constant warfare pretty much everywhere. People lived till their 40s if they were lucky. Now, you're going to probably, if things go well, knock wood, you'll live into your 80s. Are you going to be happier about that? Your message you hear, things are terrible and they're getting worse. The most dangerous time we've ever lived in. It's ridiculous. We do live in a dangerous world unless you compare it to any time that has ever come before, where things were worse in every measurable and most unmeasurable ways. Doesn't mean it's going to last forever. We don't know the future, but for right now, your generation should enjoy it because you're living in a golden age of peace and security, although it doesn't seem that way. How's that for positive?
Very positive. Thank you so much, Professor, and look forward to your talk.